My grandfather slammed his hand on the Christmas dinner table and called out the stranger sitting among us like he had waited all year for this moment. My mother laughed for far too long. My father sliced the turkey like he was cutting through the truth itself. The stranger just set his pen down and whispered that if we signed tonight, the problem would disappear. Then the doorbell rang. 2 officers walked in before my grandfather even raised his glass. My name is Violet Parker, and as I sat at the mahogany dining table in my parents' house in Columbus, Ohio, I knew that the next 5 minutes would burn this family to the ground. The air inside the house was thick, stiflingly warm, and smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the cloying scent of pine from the $300 wreath my mother, Lynn, had hung over the fireplace. Outside, the Ohio winter was doing its best to bury the suburbs in gray slush. But inside, everything was aggressively perfect. The crystal stemware caught the twinkle of the fairy lights wrapped around the banister. The napkins were folded into swans. It was a masterpiece of suburban theater, designed to convince anyone looking through the window that we were the envy of the neighborhood. I was 29 years old, and for the last decade, I had played my part in these productions. I was the quiet daughter, the one who did not quite launch, the one who worked a mid-level data entry job and drove a sedan with a rusting fender. I sat between my older brother, Brent, and his wife, Mara. Brent was vibrating. I could feel it through the floorboards, a nervous, rhythmic tapping of his heel that shook the gravy boat ever so slightly. Opposite me sat a man named Jonah Pike. He was the anomaly. He was the crack in the portrait. He was 30-something, with hair that was gelled back with military precision and a suit that cost more than my entire year of rent. He wore a heavy gold watch that slid out from his cuff every time he reached for his wine, a timepiece that looked heavy enough to anchor a boat. My father, Derek, had introduced him vaguely as a business associate who had nowhere else to go for the holidays. It was a lie, of course. Jonah Pike looked like a man who had never been alone a day in his life unless he chose to be. He sat with the predatory ease of a shark in a koi pond, eating my mother's green bean casserole with a detached amusement. We were halfway through the main course when the explosion happened. It did not start with a shout. It started with a slam that made the silverware jump. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, brought his open palm down hard on the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined dining room. The conversation died instantly. My mother's high-pitched laugh, which she had been using to fill the silence for 20 minutes, was cut off as if someone had severed her vocal cords. My father froze, his carving knife suspended halfway through a slice of white meat. Walter did not look at his daughter. He did not look at his son-in-law. He did not even look at me. His eyes, blue and hard as frozen lake water, were locked onto the stranger across the table. "I have a question," Walter said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the air pressure in the room drop. "I want to know why this stranger is running my granddaughter's company." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. You could hear the wind rattling the storm windows. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. Not out of surprise, but out of adrenaline. This was it. I let my fork clatter onto my plate. A calculated slip of the hand. I widened my eyes, letting my jaw go slack. I needed them to see shock. I needed them to see the confusion of a naive girl, not the cold calculation of a woman who had been waiting for the signal. "Dad," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" "This is Jonah. Derek told you. He is consulting on the—" "Quiet, Lynn," Walter snapped. He did not blink. He kept his gaze fixed on Jonah Pike. "I am not talking about Derek's construction failures. I am not talking about whatever shell game you are playing with the bank this week. I am asking a very specific question." Walter raised a finger, pointing it like a weapon at Jonah's chest. 4 years ago, Walter said, enunciating every syllable, I purchased a controlling interest in a firm called Glacier Gate Cold Logistics. It is a massive cold storage and transport network based out of Dayton, 18 warehouses, a fleet of 200 trucks. It is a serious asset. He turned his head slowly, looking at me for the first time. His expression softened, just for a fraction of a second, before turning back to the iron mask of judgment he wore for the rest of them. "I bought it," Walter continued, "and I put the title exclusively in the name of Violet Parker. It was a trust transfer, a safety net. I wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to the rest of you, my granddaughter would never have to worry about her future. I signed the deed. I paid the taxes up front for 5 years." My father started to saw at the turkey again. A manic, jagged motion. The knife squealed against the china platter. "Walter, let's not discuss business at the table," Derek said, his voice tight. "It is Christmas. We can talk about misunderstandings later." "Misunderstandings," Walter repeated the word as if it tasted like ash. "This morning, I received a phone call. It was from the former owner of Glaciergate. He called to wish me a Merry Christmas, and then he asked me to pass along his congratulations to the new owner for turning the quarterly profits around." Walter leaned forward. "I told him the owner was sitting right here. I told him Violet would be happy to hear it. And do you know what he said? He said, 'No, Walter, I mean the man who runs the board, the man listed as the principal executive and beneficiary, Mr. Jonah Pike.'" My mother picked up her wineglass and took a drink so large it looked like she was trying to drown herself. Brent stopped tapping his foot. He looked down at his plate, pushing a single pea around with his thumb against the handle of his spoon. Mara, my sister-in-law, went perfectly still, her eyes darting from Brent to my father, then to the stranger. I waited 2 beats. I needed the timing to be perfect. "I have a company," I asked. My voice came out small, breathy. I looked at my hands, letting them shake just enough to catch the light from the chandelier. I looked up at my father, then at my grandfather. "Grandpa, what do you mean?" I asked, raising my volume slightly. "I do not own a logistics company. I am currently paying off $3,000 in credit card debt. I am 3 months behind on my student loans. I work at Northbridge Freight Analytics processing invoices for $18 an hour." I looked directly at Jonah Pike. "If I own a company with a fleet of 200 trucks," I said, "why did I have to ask Dad for gas money last week?" Jonah Pike did not flinch. He did not look embarrassed. If anything, he looked bored. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to his plate. He picked up his wineglass, swirled the red liquid, and took a slow sip. "It is a complex structure," Jonah said. His voice was smooth, practiced. It was the voice of a man who explained away disasters for a living. "Corporate restructuring requires certain proxies, for tax purposes, for liability shielding." He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. It was a look that said, "You are a child. Go back to the kids' table." "It is not really something we can explain over cranberry sauce." "Violet," Jonah said. "Think of it as the adults handling the difficult paperwork so you do not have to—" The condescension was so thick I could taste it. He was speaking to me like I was the family pet. Walter laughed. It was a dry bark of a sound that had no humor in it. "The adults," Walter mocked. "Is that what we are calling thieves now?" Walter reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax, but the seal had been broken. He slammed the envelope down onto the table, right next to the gravy boat. The thud was heavy, solid. It sounded like a judge's gavel. "I had my lawyers pull the records this afternoon," Walter said. "I had to pay triple the hourly rate to get them to work on Christmas Day, but it was worth every penny. This envelope contains the history of Glaciergate Cold Logistics for the last 48 months. He looked at my father. Derek was sweating now. Beads of perspiration were gathering on his upper lip. "It shows a transfer of power," Walter said. "It shows a complete diversion of assets. It shows that the dividends that should have been going into a trust for Violet have been funneled into a holding company controlled by this man." He jabbed a finger toward Jonah. "And," Walter hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "it shows that the authorization for this transfer was signed by Violet Parker." I gasped. It was a theatrical gasp, but it felt good to let it out. I never signed anything. I did not even know this place existed. Exactly, Walter said. My mother stood up abruptly. Her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Okay, that is enough. She was smiling, but her eyes were terrified. She looked like a woman trying to hold back a tidal wave with a paper umbrella. Dad, you are confused. You are getting older, and sometimes the details get muddled. Derek has been helping handle some things for Violet because she is not ready for that kind of responsibility. Right, Derek. She looked at my father desperately. Tell him, Derek, tell him it is just management. We are protecting her. Derek cleared his throat. He put the knife down. It is exactly as Lynn says. Walter, you gave her a massive asset, a massive burden. She is a data analyst. For God's sake, she does not know how to run a cold chain logistics network. We stepped in. Jonah is a specialist. We brought him in to stabilize the asset until Violet was more mature. Mature. I repeated the word. I stood up slowly. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to stand tall. I am 29. I have a degree in supply chain management. That is literally what I went to school for. You told me I could not get a job in the field because I lacked experience. You told me to take the entry-level job at Northbridge to build character. Meanwhile, you were running a company in my name. We were doing it for you, Brent shouted. It was the first time my brother had spoken. His face was flushed red. Do you have any idea how much work it is? We saved you from the stress. You should be thanking us. Thanking you. I looked at Brent, my older brother, the golden boy who had failed the bar exam twice and now worked as a consultant for Dad's failing construction firm. Thanking you for what? Brent, for letting me live in a studio apartment with no heat while you bought a new boat last summer. Brent looked away, his jaw clenching. Jonah Pike tapped his fingers on the table. The sound was irritatingly calm. Look, Jonah said, this is all very touching. Family drama. Very intense. But here's the reality. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked directly at Walter. The paperwork is filed. The restructuring is in Phase 3. We have a closing deadline at midnight tonight to finalize the merger with the acquisition partner. That is why I am here. Not for the turkey. I need one final signature to ratify the previous actions and shield the family from retroactive tax liability. He reached into his briefcase, which sat by his feet, and pulled out a thin blue folder. He slid it across the table toward me. It glided over the lace tablecloth and stopped right in front of my plate. If Violet signs this, Jonah said, everything stays quiet. The company is sold. The profits are distributed according to the new agreement which, I might add, includes a generous payout for everyone at this table, including Violet. He smiled at me. Enough to pay off those credit cards, sweetheart, and maybe get a car that starts in the winter. And if I do not sign, I asked. Jonah shrugged. Then the deal collapses. The auditors come in. And based on what I have seen of your father's bookkeeping, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Let us just say that prison is a very ugly word to say on Christmas. My father went pale. My mother let out a small, strangled sob. So that is it, Walter said. He did not look at the blue folder. He looked at his family. You brought this shark into our home to strong-arm my granddaughter into legalizing your theft. It is not theft. Derek slammed his hand down, mimicking Walter's earlier motion, but with none of the authority. It is survival. You do not know what the market has been like. Walter Silver Ridge Construction is bleeding. We needed liquidity. We just borrowed against the asset. You stole it, Walter corrected him. You stole from your own daughter. We fed her, Lynn cried out. We clothed her, we raised her. Does that count for nothing? I looked at them, really looked at them. The mother who critiqued my weight every Thanksgiving, the father who forgot my birthday 3 years in a row, the brother who treated me like a nuisance. They looked small, they looked terrified, and they looked guilty as sin. Walter reached out and placed his hand over the thick manila envelope he had brought. Jonah Pike thinks that if you sign tonight, the problem disappears. Walter said to me. His voice was steady. He thinks this is a negotiation. Walter turned his gaze back to Jonah. But you are missing something. Mr. Pike, you are assuming I came here to negotiate. Walter stood up. He was 82 years old, but in that moment, he looked 10 feet tall. I did not come here to eat, Walter said, and I certainly did not come here to watch my granddaughter sign away her birthright. Then why are you here, old man? Jonah asked, his politeness finally slipping, revealing the thug underneath. To lecture us. No, Walter said. I am here to ask you one question. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. Who took the company from my granddaughter? Walter pointed at the thick envelope. Because according to these documents, the transfer was authorized 4 years ago, but the notary stamp on the transfer deed is dated for a day when Violet was in the hospital having her appendix removed. The room went dead silent. I checked the hospital records, Walter said. She was under general anesthesia at the exact hour she supposedly signed over a multi-million-dollar company to a holding group managed by Jonah Pike. My father looked like he was going to be sick. Brent closed his eyes. So, Walter said, his voice dropping to a growl, that makes it fraud. That makes it forgery. And since it crossed state lines involving a federal logistics network, that makes it a felony. Jonah Pike stopped tapping his fingers. For the first time, the smirk vanished. He looked at the thick envelope under Walter's hand, calculating the odds. You have a theory, Jonah said, his voice flat. That is all you have. I do not have a theory, Walter said. I have the police. As if on cue, the front doorbell rang. It was a cheerful, two-tone chime. Ding-dong. My mother jumped as if she had been electrocuted. Who is that? She whispered. Is it the neighbors? It is not the neighbors, I said. I spoke clearly. Dropping the act, I stopped shaking my hands. I sat up straight, picked up my fork, and set it down neatly on the edge of the plate. And it is not a guest, I added. I looked at my brother, then my father, then my mother. Grandpa did not come alone, I said. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the archway of the dining room. They did not knock. The door had been unlocked. They stood there, shaking the snow off their shoulders, their hands resting near their belts. They looked at the scene, the turkey, the candles, the terrified family, the arrogant stranger. Good evening, the older officer said. We received a call regarding a significant financial fraud and forgery in progress. Walter sat back down slowly. He picked up his wine glass and raised it toward Jonah Pike. Merry Christmas, Walter said. The silence that followed the arrival of the police was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a held breath. The split second before a dam bursts, my family did not drop to their knees. They did not weep. They did not confess. Instead, they did what they had always done when reality threatened to crack their polished veneer. They tried to rewrite the script while the audience was still watching. Derek was the first to move. He set his napkin down with a deliberate, shaky slowness, wiping grease from a lip that had gone stark white. He turned his body not toward the officers standing in the archway, but toward my grandfather, effectively turning his back on the law. It was a move of breathtaking arrogance. You are making a mistake, Walter, my father said. His voice was too loud, pitching up into a range that betrayed his panic. I have been traveling for the last 6 months. Tokyo, London, you know how chaotic the construction schedules get. I have barely looked at the domestic accounts. If there is a name on a piece of paper that does not belong there, it is a clerical error, a filing mistake. He laughed then, a dry cracking sound that bounced off the china cabinet. It is probably just an autofill error on the legal software, Derek added. You know how technology is. My mother, Lynn, seized onto this excuse like a drowning woman grabbing a piece of driftwood. She stood up and smoothed the front of her red velvet dress, her smile stretching so wide it looked painful. She walked toward the officers, but she stopped halfway, pivoting back to us as if she were hosting a cocktail party that had simply gotten a little too rowdy. "Officers, there is no need for this," she said. Her voice was a lullaby, the same tone she used to use when I scraped my knee as a child, promising me that the pain was all in my head. My father is 82. He gets confused. He forgets which accounts are which. We are just having a spirited family discussion about estate planning. Please, let me get you some coffee. Have you tried the pecan pie? It was grotesque. They were trying to suffocate the truth with hospitality. My brother, Brent, was not looking at the police. He was not looking at Mom. He had snatched the manila envelope from the table the moment Walter released it. His hands were moving with a frenetic energy, flipping through the pages so fast that the paper made a whipping sound. He was not reading to understand. He was reading to see how much of his own signature was visible. He was reading with the desperate, wild eyes of a man checking a diagnosis he already knew was terminal. I watched him, and I felt a cold, hard knot tighten in my stomach. For the last 4 years, I had believed I was a failure. That was the narrative they had fed me, and I had swallowed it whole. I looked at the crystal chandelier above us, and then I looked at my own hands, resting on the tablecloth. They were chapped from the cheap dish soap I bought at the dollar store. "Wait," I said, my voice cut through my mother's babbling. I stood up. I felt steady now. The shock had evaporated, leaving behind a clarity that was sharp enough to draw blood. "You said this company has been operating for 4 years, I said, looking at Walter. Walter nodded once, his eyes never leaving Derek. 4 years, I repeated. I turned to my parents. 4 years ago, the air conditioning in my studio apartment broke in the middle of July. It was 98 degrees inside. I called you, Dad. I asked to borrow $200 to fix it because I had not been paid yet. Do you remember what you told me?" Derek refused to meet my eyes. He stared at the carving knife. "You told me that suffering builds character." I said, "You told me that if I wanted cool air, I should work harder." So I slept on the floor with wet towels on my back for 3 weeks. I ate ramen noodles that cost 30 cents a pack because I was trying to save up for a car repair. I took a step toward the table. 2 years ago, I missed Christmas because I could not afford the flight home, and you said it was too expensive to fly me out. You sent me a box of discount cookies that were 2 weeks past their expiration date. I looked at Jonah Pike, who was watching me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. "And all that time, I owned a logistics empire," I asked. "All that time, while I was counting pennies to buy laundry detergent, there were 200 trucks moving across the state with my name on the deed. If I have assets, why do I not know about them?" I screamed the last words, and the sound shattered the polite atmosphere my mother was trying to preserve. Walter reached out and tapped the table, drawing the room's attention back to him. "You did not know because they buried you," Walter said, "and they would have kept you buried if not for a lazy secretary." He gestured to the papers Brent was clutching. "My former partner at the firm is a good man, but his office manager is incompetent," Walter said. "When they prepared the end-of-year tax summaries for the silent partners, she merged 2 mailing lists. She sent the operational breakdown for Glacier Gate to me instead of the blind trust address your father set up." Walter smiled, but it was a wolf's smile. "I opened the attachment this morning," he continued. "I expected to see a generic report. Instead, I saw a detailed org chart, and right there, at the top, listed as the operating manager and proxy for the owner, was Mr. Pike." Jonah Pike did not flinch. He did not look guilty. He simply sighed, as if he were disappointed in our lack of sophistication. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under the weight of his expensive suit. "You are using very dramatic words for standard business practices," Jonah said. His voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. "I was not stealing anything. I was invited." "Invited?" I asked. "By whom?" "By the acting agents of the estate," Jonah said, gesturing vaguely at Derek and Brent. "The company needed a restructure. It was hemorrhaging potential. Your family realized that a 25-year-old girl with a liberal arts background could not handle a cold chain supply network. They brought me in to optimize. Optimize, I repeated. Is that what you call siphoning the profits into a shell company? I am a turnaround specialist, Jonah said, sounding bored. I clean up messes, I make things profitable, and in exchange, I take a management fee and a percentage of ownership. It is entirely legal. We were simply waiting for the restructuring to finalize before bringing you into the loop. We wanted to present you with a finished product, not a headache. It was a lie so polished it almost sounded like the truth. It was the kind of lie that required $100,000 in legal fees to craft. My mother clapped her hands together. The sound was sharp and jarring. Exactly, Lynn cried out. See, it is just business. It is just a strategy. Now, who wants dessert? I made the pumpkin cheesecake that Brent loves. She reached for a stack of dessert plates, her hands trembling so badly that the china rattled like castanets. She started passing them out, forcing them into our hands. Here, take a plate, she said to me. Eat something. Violet, you get so cranky when your blood sugar is low. I stared at the plate she shoved toward me. It was hand-painted china. It probably cost more than my car. I looked at my father. Derek was gripping the handle of the carving knife so hard that his knuckles were colorless. The veins in his hand stood out like cords. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the space between the salt and pepper shakers, his jaw working, grinding his teeth. It was the look of a trapped animal calculating whether to bite its own leg off to escape. I looked at Brent. He had stopped reading. He was just staring at the page, his face gray. And then I looked at Mara. My sister-in-law was the only one not moving. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She was not eating. She was not helping Mom pass the plates. She was watching Brent with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not fear, it was disgust. She looked at him like he was something she had stepped in. She felt my gaze and looked up. For a second, our eyes locked. She did not look away. She did not offer a sympathetic smile. She just held my gaze, confirming what I already suspected. She knew. She had known. And she was done pretending. Walter cleared his throat. The sound was low, but it stopped my mother's frantic plate passing. You can serve all the cake you want. Lynn, Walter said, but you cannot sweeten this. He looked around the table, his eyes landing on each of them in turn. Today is Christmas, Walter said. It is the day we celebrate family, but it is also the day when the illusions break. It is the day people find out that the family they thought they had does not exist. He pointed a finger at Derek. I thought I had a son-in-law who was a man of honor. I was wrong. He pointed at Brent. I thought I had a grandson who wanted to build a legacy. I was wrong. He looked at me. And I thought I had a granddaughter who was too weak to fight for what was hers. He paused, and his eyes softened. I hope I am wrong about that, too. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The police officers were still watching, their faces impassive, waiting for the signal to intervene or for the violence to erupt. Jonah Pike broke the silence. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim silver pen. He clicked it open. He reached for the thin stack of papers he had placed on the table earlier, the contract he had been hiding under his napkin. He slid the papers across the mahogany wood until they rested directly in front of me. He set the pen on top of them. Let us cut the theatrics, Jonah said. He checked his heavy gold watch. The police can arrest us. Sure. They can drag this out for 5 years in court. The legal fees will bankrupt the company. The assets will be frozen. The trucks will stop running. The inventory will spoil. By the time you get the keys back, the business will be a graveyard. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Or, he said softly, you sign this. We classify the last 4 years as a retroactive management agreement. You get a lump sum payout tonight, enough to change your life. Your father stays out of jail. Your brother keeps his law license, and we all go home. He tapped the paper with his index finger. It is a simple choice. Violet, you can have justice, or you can have a family. You cannot have both. Sign it. And tonight never happened. The paper sat there, white and crisp, a contract to sell my soul for peace. My mother was holding her breath. her eyes pleading with me. Derek looked up, hope flickering in his terrified eyes. I looked at the pen. I looked at the police, and then I looked at my grandfather, who was waiting to see if the blood in my veins was water or iron. The silver pen Jonah Pike had placed on the table seemed to vibrate with its own gravity. It sat there on the crisp, white document, a small metal bar that separated my past from my future. The police officers remained by the archway, their presence heavy and silent, waiting for a reason to step further into the room or to turn around and leave. My father, Derek, looked at the pen, then at the police, and finally at me. He let out a long, ragged exhale, the kind of sound a tire makes when it finally gives up on the highway. He decided, in that moment, that the best defense was not denial, but an aggressive form of benevolence. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back, spreading his hands in a gesture that was meant to look open and honest but just looked practiced. "Violet, honey, you need to lower your voice," Derek said. He spoke with the weary patience of a parent explaining why a toddler cannot play with a steak knife. "You are looking at this all wrong. You see the police, you see the documents, you see Jonah here. And your mind jumps to the worst possible conclusion because you do not understand the complexity of what we deal with." He gestured vaguely around the room, encompassing the house, the dinner, and the lifestyle he was frantically trying to maintain. "You are 29, Violet, but let us be honest with each other. You have never been a business person. You are creative. You are gentle. You panic when your car insurance goes up by $10. I watched him, keeping my face blank. He was building a cage out of my own perceived weaknesses. When Walter transferred that asset," Derek continued, gaining confidence as he spoke, "he made a mistake. He dumped a shark tank into a goldfish bowl. GlacierGate is not just a warehouse. It is a liability monster. Unions, OSHA regulations, insurance premiums that cost more than this house. If we had handed you the keys 4 years ago, you would have been bankrupt in 6 months. We did not steal anything. We stepped in to catch the falling knife so it would not cut your hands." My mother, Lynn, immediately chimed in. She reached across the table, her fingers fluttering near my hand but not quite touching it, as if she were afraid I might bite. "It is true, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling with a terrifyingly sincere sweetness. "We were so worried. Do you remember when you called me crying because your boss at the coffee shop shouted at you? That was just a coffee shop. Imagine if it was a Teamsters union rep. We did it to protect you. We wanted you to have your 20s to find yourself, to live without that crushing weight on your shoulders." She looked at the police officers and offered them a fragile, tragic smile. "We did it all for her." She told them, "Everything we do is for our children." Brent, who had finally stopped scanning the documents for his own signature, cleared his throat. He saw the angle our parents were taking, and he latched onto it with the desperation of a drowning man finding a life raft. "It is a standard legal vehicle." "Violet," Brent said. He tried to use his courtroom voice, but it cracked. "We executed a limited power of attorney. It is a common instrument. We just needed the ability to make decisions on the fly without dragging you out of your data entry job every 10 minutes to sign permit applications. It was a convenience measure, nothing more." I looked at them. The 3 of them formed a triangle of gaslighting so dense it was hard to breathe. They had rehearsed this dynamic for years. Derek the protector, Lynn the martyr, Brent the expert. I picked up my water glass. My hand was steady. I took a sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the taste of the turkey I had barely touched. "So it was temporary," I said. My voice was calm. I did not scream. I did not cry. I asked the question with the genuine curiosity of a student trying to understand a difficult lecture. "Of course," Derek said, nodding vigorously. "Temporary, interim management, just until you were ready." I nodded slowly. I looked at the blue folder Jonah had slid across the table. "Then why?" I asked. "Does the deed history say the rights were transferred, not managed?" The room went quiet again. Derek blinked. I looked at Brent. "You said it was a power of attorney." I said, "A power of attorney lets you act on my behalf. It does not remove my name from the title. but Grandpa's documents say that Glaciergate was sold to a holding company called Ironclad Holdings. I turned to Jonah Pike, and Ironclad Holdings is not a management firm. Is it? I asked. It is an acquisition shell. Derek shifted in his chair. He wiped sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand. That is a technicality. Derek stammered. It is about tax brackets. Violet, you would not understand the nuance. We had to move the asset into an LLC structure to shield it from capital gains volatility. It is a technical adjustment. It looks like a sale on paper, but it is really just moving money from your left pocket to your right pocket to keep the IRS from taking it all. He was talking fast now, throwing out words he hoped I did not know. We had to insulate the primary asset. Derek said, if we kept it in your name, directly, you would be liable for every slip and fall in the loading dock. By moving it to Ironclad, we created a liability firewall. It is smart business. It is what rich people do. Violet, we were trying to make you rich. Walter Caldwell let out a short, sharp snort of disgust. He reached into his own folder, the one he had guarded all dinner, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slapped it down on top of the lace tablecloth. Stop treating her like she is stupid. Derek, Walter said. His voice was like grinding stones. Walter pointed a gnarled finger at a highlighted line on the document. This is the incorporation paper for Ironclad Holdings, Walter said. Look at the line for principal owner and beneficiary. He looked at Derek, daring him to read it. It does not say Violet Parker. Walter said, it does not say Derek Parker. It does not even say the Parker Family Trust. Walter looked at the stranger in the expensive suit. It says Jonah Pike. Walter turned back to his son-in-law. Is that a technical adjustment? Walter asked. Did you accidentally adjust the ownership of a $50 million asset into the pocket of a man you met at a golf course? Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish on a dock. The protection narrative was crumbling under the weight of specific facts. Jonah Pike sighed. He sounded annoyed, like a man whose dinner had been interrupted by a rude waiter. He picked up his wineglass and inspected the rim for spots. You are simplifying a complex merger, Jonah said. His voice was bored, authoritative. He was used to being the smartest person in the room, or at least the one with the most expensive lawyers. I do not own Ironclad in the traditional sense, Jonah said. I am the custodial trustee. The asset had to be parked somewhere neutral while the restructuring took place. Legally, yes, my name is on the deed, but that is standard operating procedure for a blind trust acquisition. I hold the keys. I do not live in the house. He looked at me, his eyes cold and dead. Everything is legal. Violet, I have the paperwork to prove it. I did not wake up one morning and decide to steal a logistics company. I was hired. I was given a mandate to execute a specific financial maneuver. I just followed the instructions I was given. I stared at him. He was slick. He was professional. He was the weapon my family had hired to kill my future, and he was blaming the trigger for being pulled. I leaned forward. I rested my elbows on the table, mirroring the posture he had used earlier. You were given instructions. I repeated. Correct, Jonah said. And you were given the authorization codes I asked. The original deeds, the social security numbers, the birth certificates needed to verify identity. Jonah nodded, all provided in the initial dossier. I looked at him, letting the silence stretch for a beat. Who gave them to you? I asked. The question hung in the air. It was simple, it was direct, and it was dangerous. Jonah paused. He looked at Derek. He looked at Lynn. He looked at Brent. For the first time, I saw a flicker of calculation in his eyes. He realized that the united front was a myth. He realized that if the police officers stepped forward, someone was going to have to take the fall, and Jonah Pike did not look like the kind of man who took falls for other people. I was retained by the family, Jonah said carefully. Which one? I asked. My voice was soft, but it felt like a knife point. Did my mother give you my birth certificate? I asked. Lynn gasped. Violet. How can you... Did my father give you the deed? I asked, cutting her off. Derek stared at his plate. Or was it Brent? I asked. Did my brother, the lawyer, Hand over the legal identity of his little sister so you could build your liability firewall? I looked at Brent. He was pale, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. Who handed you the knife? Jonah, I asked. Because you are sitting here telling me you just cut the meat. But someone had to hand you the blade. Jonah smiled. It was a small, cruel smile. He realized I was not the victim anymore. I was the prosecutor. That is a matter of attorney-client privilege, Jonah said. Privilege does not apply to fraud, Walter said from the head of the table. And it certainly does not apply when the client is accusing the attorney of theft in front of 2 police officers. The tension in the room was so high it felt like the windows might shatter. My family was paralyzed. They were terrified to speak, terrified that one word would shatter the fragile lie they were all clinging to. And in that silence, I saw movement. It was Mara. My sister-in-law had been a statue for the entire meal. She had sat beside Brent, watching him lie, watching him sweat, watching him sell me out. She had always been the outsider, the one Lynn criticized for her cooking, the one Derek ignored because she did not come from money. She lifted her head. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She picked up her napkin and placed it on the table. She did not look at Brent. She did not look at the police. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with red, but they were clear. There was no confusion in them. There was no family loyalty. There was only a profound, exhausting realization. She stared right into my eyes, and for a second, the rest of the room vanished. Her look was a message. It was a scream without sound. Do not believe them. Her eyes said, do not let them talk you down. Do not sign that paper. It was a look of absolute warning. It was the look of a woman who had seen behind the curtain and was terrified of what she had found. Then, just as quickly, she looked down at her hands, but the signal had been sent. I turned back to my father. You keep talking about protection. Dad, I said, you keep saying you did this to save me from stress. I stood up. I walked over to the sideboard where my purse was sitting. I picked it up and walked back to the table. I unzipped it and pulled out a crumpled receipt. This is from the pharmacy, I said. I put it on the table next to the silver pen. It is for my anxiety medication. It cost me $40. I had to choose between that and filling my gas tank last week. I chose the gas so I could get to work. I have been driving around with a panic attack stuck in my throat for 6 days because I could not afford to breathe. I looked at Lynn. You say you wanted to save me from stress, I asked. You own a company worth millions in my name. You have been taking the profits for 4 years, and you watched me decide which bills to skip. You came to my apartment. You saw the mold in the bathroom. You saw the empty fridge. I leaned down, bringing my face close to hers. You did not protect me. Mom, you fed off me. Lynn began to cry. It was not the soft, tragic crying from earlier. It was an ugly, hacking sound. We were going to pay you back, she sobbed. Once the deal closed tonight, we were going to give you a check, a big check. We just needed the bridge loan. Derek slammed his hand on the table. Lynn, shut up. But it was too late. The words were out. Bridge loan, Walter said. He savored the words. So it was not a restructure, Walter said. It was not a tax shield. You were broke. You spent your own money, and then you spent hers, and now you are selling the golden goose to pay for the feed. Walter looked at the police officers. I think we are done with the appetizer, Walter said. I looked at Jonah. He was still holding his pen, but his knuckles were white. The expert facade was cracking. He wasn't a consultant anymore. He was a fence for stolen goods. I am not signing. I said, I looked at the blue folder, and I am not leaving. Jonah Pike narrowed his eyes. If you do not sign, he hissed, his voice dropping the professional act entirely, then your father loses this house, your brother gets disbarred, and the bank takes everything. Is that what you want? You want to be the reason your family is on the street. I looked at Mara again. She was watching me, holding her breath. I looked at my grandfather, and then I looked at the strangers who shared my last name. I am not the reason. I said, I sat back down. I am just the witness." Walter Caldwell did not shout. He did not slam his fist on the table again. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and retrieved his phone. He unlocked it with a thumb that was steady and deliberate, pressed a single speed dial button, and held the device to his ear. The room was so quiet that I could hear the connection tone buzzing on the other end. "Come inside," Walter said into the receiver. "Right now." He hung up before the person on the other end could answer. He placed the phone face down on the tablecloth, right next to the gravy boat that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "Who is coming in?" my mother asked. Her voice was thin, brittle as dried leaves. "Is it more police?" Walter did not answer her. He picked up his fork and knife, cut a small piece of turkey, and ate it with the methodical calmness of a man who had nowhere else to be. The two officers in the doorway shifted their weight, but did not intervene. They seemed to understand that they were the muscle, but Walter was the conductor. 10 minutes passed. The silence in the dining room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the ragged breathing of my father. Derek. He was staring at the front door, his eyes wide and unblinking, like a man waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. Then, the heavy oak front door opened. The sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor echoed through the entryway. It was a sharp, rhythmic staccato. Click, click, click. It was the sound of authority approaching. A woman walked into the dining room. She was tall, wearing a charcoal wool coat over a severe black suit. Her hair was silver, cut into a sharp bob that framed a face made of angles and intelligence. She carried a hard-shell leather briefcase in one hand and a thick stack of files in the other. I recognized her immediately. Evelyn Kessler. She was the most expensive corporate litigator in Columbus, a woman who was rumored to have made grown CEOs cry during depositions. She had handled my grandfather's estate planning for 30 years. She did not say Merry Christmas. She did not nod at my parents. She did not acknowledge the holiday decorations or the congealing feast on the table. She walked straight to the empty chair at the end of the table, opposite Walter, and set her briefcase down with a heavy thud. "Good evening, Walter," Evelyn said. Her voice was cool, stripped of any warmth. "I have the addendums. Show them," Walter said. Evelyn opened the briefcase. The latches snapped open with a sound like gunshots. She pulled out a large, poster-sized document that had been folded into quarters. She unfolded it and smoothed it out over the untouched side dishes. It was a timeline, a long horizontal line marked with dates, spanning from 4 years ago to the present day. Above the line were dates of corporate actions. Below the line were personal location data. Evelyn took a gold pen from her pocket and pointed to a date near the start of the timeline. October 14th, 4 years ago. Evelyn said. She spoke to the room, but her eyes were on the police officers. On this date, a document was filed with the Secretary of State authorizing the transfer of operational control of Glacier Gate Logistics to a proxy management firm. This document required a notarized signature from the primary owner, Violet Parker. She pulled a photocopy of a signature page from her file and placed it on the table. It showed my name, written in blue ink, Violet Parker. I stared at it. It looked like my name. It had the loops, the slant. It was a good copy, but Evelyn did not stop there. On October 14th, 4 years ago. Evelyn continued, looking at me. Where were you? Violet. I blinked, my mind racing back. October, 4 years ago. That was the year I graduated. That was the autumn I was frantically applying for jobs. I was in Cincinnati. I said, I remember because my car broke down on the highway on the way back. I was interviewing for a junior analyst position at Procter & Gamble. I was in the interview from 9 in the morning until noon. I said, then I was at a repair shop called Lou's Auto until 6 in the evening waiting for a new alternator. Evelyn nodded. She produced a second piece of paper. This is a copy of the visitor log from the Procter & Gamble headquarters in Cincinnati, dated October 14th. Evelyn said, Violet Parker signed in at 8:45 in the morning, and this is a credit card receipt from Lou's Auto Repair in Sharonville, time-stamped at 5:30 in the afternoon. She placed the receipts next to the signature page. The document transferring the company was notarized in Columbus at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Evelyn said. She looked at my father. Unless Violet has learned to bilocate, it is physically impossible for her to have signed this document in front of a notary in Columbus while she was sitting in a mechanic's waiting room in Cincinnati. Derek laughed. It was a nervous, high-pitched sound. Well, obviously. Derek said. He waved a hand dismissively. Obviously, she did not sign it that day. That is just a filing date. You know how these things are. We probably had her sign it a few days before, and the notary just backdated it for convenience. It happens all the time. It is a clerical quirk. It is a crime, Walter said softly. But go on. My mother jumped in, her voice breathless. Derek is right, Lynn said. We had so many papers on the table back then. Violet probably signed a stack of them on the weekend, and we just filed them later. We were just trying to get the paperwork done so the business could keep running. It was a copy of a copy. You know how the ink looks different on copies? Evelyn ignored them. She reached into her bag and pulled out a magnifying glass. She placed it over the signature on the document. I am not a forensic handwriting analyst, Evelyn said, but I have eyes. She invited the police officer to lean in. Look at the pressure points, Evelyn said. She traced the curve of the V in my name. When Violet signs her name, she uses a light touch on the upstroke and a heavy touch on the downstroke. We have samples of her signature from her college loans and her lease agreements. It is consistent. It is rhythmic. She pointed to the document on the table. This signature. The pressure is uniform all the way through. It is heavy. It digs into the paper. This was not written by someone signing their own name quickly. This was written by someone drawing a picture of a signature. It is slow. It is deliberate. And there is a hesitation mark right here, at the top of the P. She looked up at Brent. It looks like the pen stopped for a fraction of a second. Evelyn said, as if the writer forgot which way the loop was supposed to go. Brent flinched. He was sweating profusely now. He pulled at his collar. That is ridiculous, Brent stammered. He spoke so fast the words blurred together. You are analyzing a photocopy. You cannot judge pen pressure from a scan. That is inadmissible. And besides, we used a mobile notary service. Those guys are incompetent. They probably mixed up the dates or traced over a faint signature to make it scan better. You are trying to build a conspiracy out of a bad clerical job. It is a service provider error. We can sue the notary if it makes you happy. He looked around the table, his eyes wild. It is just bad paperwork, Brent shouted. It does not mean anything, does it? Evelyn asked. She turned back to her timeline. Let us look at the pattern, she said. She pointed to a date 2 years ago, May 12th. Evelyn read, a board resolution is passed, removing Violet Parker's veto power over asset liquidation. The signature on this document is dated the same day. Violet was hospitalized for food poisoning. She pointed to another date, last December. Evelyn said, a modification to the operating agreement, allowing the transfer of cash reserves to an external holding company. The signature is dated Christmas Eve. Violet was working a double shift at the call center that night. We have her time card. Evelyn looked at my family. Her gaze was clinical, dissecting them layer by layer. Every single time a document was signed that stripped Violet of her rights, she was verifiably occupied elsewhere. Evelyn said, these are not clerical errors. This is not a lazy notary. This is a systematic, chronological removal of ownership, executed on dates when the victim was unable to intervene. The room was silent. The clerical error defense lay dead on the table, bleeding out under the weight of the timeline. Jonah Pike shifted in his chair. He did not look rattled by the forgery accusations. He looked at his watch again. He seemed to be calculating something entirely different. This is all very interesting history, Jonah said. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. But we are losing sight of the objective. The deal with the acquisition partners expires at midnight. That is in 3 hours. He tapped the blue folder he had given me. If we miss that window, the offer is withdrawn, Jonah said. The liquidity injection vanishes, and then the auditors from the bank arrive on Monday morning. And if you think this timeline looks bad, Wait until you see what the bank finds when they audit Silver Ridge Construction. He looked at me, ignoring Evelyn. Violet, listen to me, Jonah said. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Your grandfather and his lawyer are trying to prove a point. They are right. Okay, they are right. The paperwork is messy. Maybe your brother cut some corners. Maybe your dad got sloppy. He gestured to the police. But do you really want to send your father to prison over a signature? Jonah asked. Do you want to see your mother on the news? Because that is what happens next. Unless you sign this ratification. He pushed the silver pen toward me again. If you sign now, Jonah said, you validate all the previous actions. You make them legal retroactively. The forgery becomes an authorized agency. The theft becomes a loan. The crime disappears. And you walk away with a check. The room held its breath. My father looked at me with tears in his eyes. Not tears of remorse, but tears of terror. My mother was gripping her napkin so hard her knuckles were blue. Just sign it, baby, Lynn whispered. Please, just fix it. I looked at the pen. It was so easy. Just a scribble of ink. I could end the tension. I could make the police leave. I could go back to being the daughter they wanted, the one who cleaned up their messes. But then I looked at the timeline Evelyn had drawn. I looked at the dates. That date in May, I said, pointing to the chart, the one where I lost my veto power. I looked at Derek. I was in the hospital that day because I ate the leftovers you sent home with me. Dad, I was so sick I thought I was going to die. And while I was throwing up, you were signing my name to sell my future. Derek looked away. And that Christmas Eve, I said, pointing to the other date. I worked that double shift because I wanted to buy Brent a nice watch for Christmas. I spent 14 hours on the phone with angry customers to buy a gift for the brother who was busy writing me out of my own company. I looked at Brent. The watch on his wrist was the one I had bought. He covered it with his other hand, shame finally piercing his panic. I am not signing. I said. Jonah's face hardened. You are making a mistake, Jonah said cold. You are choosing destruction. Walter Caldwell stood up. He walked over to the timeline Evelyn had laid out. He placed his hand on the table, right next to the silver pen. She is not choosing destruction, Walter said. She is choosing clarity. Walter looked at Jonah. You keep saying we need to finish this tonight. Mr. Pike, you keep checking your watch. You seem very concerned about this midnight deadline. Walter leaned in close. There is no acquisition partner. Is there? Walter asked. Jonah blinked. It was a micro-reaction, a tiny twitch of the eyelid. But it was there. Of course there is, Jonah said. But his voice lacked the oily smoothness it had earlier. We have a buyer lined up, a multinational logistics firm. No, Walter said. You don't. Walter picked up the blue folder, the contract Jonah wanted me to sign. He did not open it. He just weighed it in his hand. My investigators did not just look at the past, Walter said. They looked at the market. There is no buzz about a GlacierGate sale. There is no due diligence being done by any major firm. He threw the folder back down. This is not a sale, Walter said. This is an extraction. You are not selling the company to a third party. You are selling the assets, the trucks, the warehouses, the land to yourself, or to another shell company you control. You are stripping the meat off the bone and leaving the carcass for the creditors. Walter looked at Derek. Your construction company is drowning. Isn't it? Derek Walter asked. You owe money to people who do not use lawyers to collect debts. That is why you are desperate. That is why you brought in a butcher like Jonah Pike. Derek put his head in his hands. He made a sound like a wounded dog. Walter turned to the police officers. Officers, Walter said. His voice was grim. No one is signing anything tonight. There is no deal. There is no family agreement. He looked at Jonah, then at Brent, then at Derek. Tonight, only one thing is going to be finalized, Walter said. He pointed to the timeline on the table, the truth. Evelyn Kessler closed her folder with a snap. She looked at Jonah Pike with a smile that was sharp enough to cut glass. And Mr. Pike, Evelyn said, I suggest you stop worrying about the midnight deadline. You should be worrying about the fact that you just admitted, in front of law enforcement, to knowing about the irregularities in the paperwork. Jonah froze. He realized, too late, that in his rush to close the deal, he had stopped pretending to be innocent and started bargaining like an accomplice. The dinner party was over. The interrogation had begun. The dining room had become a courtroom. But Evelyn Kessler was not finished presenting her evidence. She did not look at the police officers or my grandfather. She looked directly at me. Her expression was not pitying. It was the hard, focused look of a surgeon who knows that the next cut is going to hurt, but it is necessary to remove the rot. Evelyn reached into her briefcase again. This time, she did not pull out legal deeds or tax forms. She pulled out a stack of printouts that looked like standard email correspondence. They were stapled together in neat bundles. "We have established that your family stole your assets," Evelyn said. Her voice was level. "We have established that they forged your signature to do it. But there was always a lingering question in your grandfather's mind." She slid the first bundle across the table. "Why did you never leave?" Evelyn asked. I looked at her, confused. The question felt like an accusation. "I tried," I said. "I applied for jobs in Chicago, in Denver. I had second interviews. I never got the offer. The market is tough." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "The market is not that tough." "Violet," she said, "you graduated in the top 10% of your class. You have certifications in logistics management. You are qualified." She tapped the paper in front of me. "Read the top email," she said. I looked down. It was a printout of an email sent to the Human Resources Director at Distinct Logistics in Chicago. That was a job I had interviewed for 3 years ago. I had crushed the interview. I was sure I had the job. Then, 2 days later, they ghosted me. The email was sent from an address I did not recognize, industrywatchdog88@gmail.com. The subject line read, "Reference regarding Violet Parker candidate application." I read the body of the text. My breath hitched in my throat. "To whom it may concern. I am writing as a former colleague who wishes to remain anonymous for fear of retribution. While Ms. Parker is charming in interviews, you should be aware of significant behavioral issues. She was let go from her previous internship due to theft of office supplies and a pattern of emotional instability. She is known to cause drama in the workplace and is currently battling substance abuse issues that affect her punctuality. Proceed with caution." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started to shake, crumpling the edge of the paper. "Theft," I whispered. "Substance abuse. I have never stolen a paperclip in my life. I do not even drink on weeknights." Evelyn slid another bundle across. "This one was sent to the hiring manager at Apex Freight in Denver," she said. I read it. This one was even worse. It claimed I had been investigated for falsifying data and that I had a reputation for sleeping with supervisors to cover up my mistakes. "And this one," Evelyn said, sliding a third packet, "was sent to the regional director at Amazon, the night before your final interview last year." I stared at the papers. There were dozens of them. Every time I had tried to escape, every time I had reached for a lifeline that would pull me out of my parents' basement and into my own life. Someone had cut the rope. I looked up at my family. The room was spinning. "This is why I did not get the Chicago job," I asked. My voice sounded far away. "I spent 3 months thinking I wasn't good enough. I spent 3 months depressed, thinking I was a failure because I could not land an entry-level position." I looked at my mother. "You comforted me." I said, "I remembered the night I got the rejection email from Denver." I cried in her lap. She had stroked my hair and told me that maybe it was for the best. She told me the world was a hard place and that I was safer at home. "You knew." I said. Evelyn cut in, her voice sharp as a razor. "They did not just know." "Violet," Evelyn said. She turned the page on her own master copy. "We had our forensic IT team trace the headers on these emails," Evelyn said. "It was not difficult. The sender used a Gmail account, but they did not use a VPN. They did not mask their IP address." Evelyn pointed a manicured finger at the router blinking in the hallway corner. "Every single one of these emails originated from the IP address registered to this house." Evelyn said, "Specifically, the MAC address associated with a laptop registered to Brent Parker. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out. I turned to my brother. Brent was staring at the tablecloth, his face a mask of sheer panic. "Brent?" I asked. He jerked his head up. "It wasn't me," Brent stammered. His voice was high and thinned by fear. "The Wi-Fi. You know how Wi-Fi is. It is insecure. Neighbors piggyback on it all the time. Someone must have hacked the network. It is a spoofing attack. People do that. They drive by and hack your IP to send spam." He looked at the police officers, desperate for them to buy his nonsensical technical defense. "I have been telling Dad to upgrade the security protocols," Brent shouted. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. A hacker framed us. It was pathetic. It was the lie of a child caught with his hand in the jar, claiming a ghost ate the cookies." Mara, who had been staring at her hands, made a sound. It was a low, bitter laugh. She turned her head slowly to look at her husband. "A hacker?" Mara asked. Brent looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Mara, honey, you know how technology works. You know I wouldn't stop it," Mara said. Her voice was not loud, but it stopped him dead. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I saw the drafts." "Brent," Mara said. Brent froze. "2 years ago," Mara continued, "I borrowed your laptop to look up a recipe because my phone died. You had left your email open in the background. I saw the sent folder. I saw the email to the recruiter in Denver." Brent's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "I thought about asking you." Mara said, "I thought about telling Violet. But I was scared. You told me it was just family politics. You told me Violet was unstable, and you were trying to stop her from taking a job she couldn't handle." She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. I let myself believe him. "Violet?" she said, because it was easier than admitting I married a monster. "But a hacker. Really, how much longer are you going to lie?" Brent shrank back in his chair. The hacker defense had evaporated. My mother, Lynn, let out a loud, wailing sob. It was a theatrical, practice sound, the kind she used when a waiter got her order wrong and she wanted a free meal. "We just wanted you to stay," Lynn cried. She reached out, grabbing for my hand, but I pulled it away as if she were burning hot. "Violet, listen to Mommy," she sobbed. "The world is so dangerous. You are so sensitive. We knew that if you went to Chicago or Denver, you would be eaten alive. We did it out of love. We wanted to keep you here, where we can look after you, where you are safe." She looked at Derek for support. "Tell her, Derek. Tell her we did it for love." Derek nodded vigorously. He looked like a man trying to sell a car with no engine. "Your mother is right," Derek said. His voice was shaking. "We were protecting you. You do not know what it is like out there. We wanted to build a sanctuary for you, a family business where you could be part of something. Part of something." I asked. I stood up. I felt cold. A deep, freezing cold that started in my bones and worked its way out. I was not part of the business. "Dad," I said, "I was the livestock." I looked at the emails spread out on the table. "You did not keep me here because you loved me." I said, "You kept me here because you needed a signature you could control. If I moved to Chicago, I might have shown my tax returns to a landlord. I might have applied for a mortgage. I might have found out that I owned a company." I looked at Lynn. "You sabotaged my life." I said, "You destroyed my career. You made me believe I was worthless so I would never look at the paperwork." Derek stood up, trying to regain his physical dominance in the room. "We kept you safe," Derek shouted. "We gave you a roof over your head when you could not find work, because you made sure I could not find work." I screamed back. The room fell silent again. I lowered my voice. I looked at my father, then my mother. "You keep using that word," I said. "Safe." I leaned over the table. "Did you want me safe, or did you want me controlled?" Derek could not meet my eyes. He looked down at the ruined Christmas dinner. Jonah Pike cleared his throat. He picked up his silver pen and tapped it against the edge of the table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the emotional fog. He did not care about the betrayal. He did not care about the emails. He cared about the timeline. This is all very touching, Jonah said. He checked his watch again. Really, it is like a soap opera. But while we are discussing the nuances of parenting, the clock is ticking. He looked at Derek. The buyers are waiting for the confirmation, Jonah said. If I do not send the signed ratification by midnight, the escrow account closes, the transfer cancels. He turned his cold eyes to me. And if the transfer cancels, Violet, the money that your father has already spent well. Let us just say the people he borrowed it from will be very unhappy. My head snapped up. Already spent, I asked. Jonah smiled. It was a shark smile. You did not think this was just about fixing the past. Did you, Jonah asked. He gestured to the blue folder. This isn't just a ratification of the last 4 years. This is a closing document for a new sale. A sale happening tonight. Your father has already taken a down payment, a very large down payment, and he has already spent it trying to keep his construction company from collapsing. Jonah leaned forward. If you do not sign, he said, your father does not just go to jail for fraud. He goes to the hospital, because the people who fronted him that cash are not the kind of people who send emails to HR. They break legs. I looked at Derek. He was gray. He was shaking. So that is it, I said. I looked at the police, then at Evelyn, then at my grandfather. You are not asking me to sign to save the family. I said, you are asking me to sign because you sold something you did not own, took the money, and now the bill is due. Jonah tapped the pen again. Tap, 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 tick-tock, Violet, Jonah said. The silence that hung over the table after Jonah's threat was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the invisible weight of a clock ticking down to an explosion. Jonah Pike sat back. His point made. He had just told us that my father was not merely a thief, but a man in debt to dangerous people. He had turned the temperature in the room from uncomfortable to lethal. But before the reality of the money could fully settle, the pressure in the room found a weak point, and that weak point was my brother. Brent cracked. It was not a slow fissure. It was a sudden, violent shattering of his composure. He looked at the emails Evelyn had spread across the table, the proof that he had sabotaged my career for years, and then he looked at the police officers. He realized that the hacker excuse was dead. He realized that Jonah did not care about him. He realized he was alone. I did not want to send them, Brent shouted. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. He did not bother to pick it up. He pointed a shaking finger across the table, not at me, at our mother. It was her idea, Brent screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. She made me do it. She came to my room every time Violet had an interview. She told me what to write. She said we had to stop her. My mother, Lynn, froze. Her hand was halfway to her mouth, holding a napkin. She looked at her son with wide, betrayed eyes, as if he had just stabbed her with the butter knife. Brent, she gasped. How can you say that? Because it is true, Brent yelled. He was panting. His face flushed a splotchy, ugly red. You told me that if Violet left, the family trust would dissolve. You told me that if she got a job in Chicago, she would take the company with her and we would be left with nothing. You sat on the edge of my bed and dictated the words, Mom. You told me to say she stole office supplies. You told me to say she was unstable. You said, make it sound professional. Brent, use your legal words. He turned to me, his eyes wide and wet with panic. Violet, you have to believe me. Brent pleaded. I just typed what she said. I was just the scribe. I did not want to hurt you. I just wanted to help the family. I looked at him, my brother, the man who had bought me ice cream when I was 6, the man who had walked me to my first day of kindergarten. He was standing there, a 32-year-old attorney, hiding behind his mother's skirts like a coward. You are pathetic, I said softly. Lynn slammed her hands onto the table. Stop it! Stop attacking your brother, she shrieked. She turned to me, and for the first time in 10 minutes, she actually looked at me. But she did not look at me with guilt. She looked at me with a terrifying, twisted righteousness. Yes, I told him to write them. Lynn said. Her voice was trembling, but it was defiant, and I would do it again. She pressed her hand to her chest, right over her heart. I did it because I love you. Violet, a mother knows what is best for her child. You were not ready to leave. You are fragile. You have always been fragile. If you had gone to Chicago, you would have been all alone. You would have been eaten alive by those people. I kept you here where you belong, where you are loved. Loved, I asked. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a hysterical, jagged thing. You got me fired before I was even hired. You painted me as a thief and a drug addict to strangers. You made me doubt my own sanity. That is love. It is protection, Lynn cried. The world is cruel. Violet, we are the only ones who care about you. She looked around the room, seeking validation, but she found none. The police officers stared at her with stone faces. Evelyn Kessler looked at her with open disgust. Even Derek, my father, looked away. Derek cleared his throat. He saw that Lynn's emotional appeal was failing, so he tried to pivot. He tried to turn the blame back onto me, to make my character the problem. Your mother is emotional, Derek said, his voice gruff, but you have to understand the position you put us in. Violet, he pointed his carving knife at me. You were always difficult, he said, even as a kid, always wanting to run off, always wanting to do things your own way. You were stubborn. You wanted to go to art school. Remember, you wanted to travel. You never cared about this family's legacy. He gestured to the house, to the expensive furniture, to the life he had built on a foundation of lies. We had to restrain you, Derek said. It is like pruning a tree. Sometimes you have to cut back the branches to make it grow right. We knew that if we let you go, you would never come back, and we needed the family to stay together. You needed my signature. I corrected him. You did not need me. You needed the asset that Grandpa put in my name. Derek's face hardened. You are an ungrateful child. He spat. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing, I shouted. You stole my company. You stole my career. And you made me pay rent to live in a house that my money was paying for. The room fell into a stunned silence. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He opened his mouth to roar at me, to bully me into submission one last time. But before he could speak, a quiet voice cut through the noise. He is not going to stop lying. Violet. It was Mara. My sister-in-law was still sitting next to Brent's empty chair. She had not moved when he knocked it over. She had not moved when Lynn started screaming. She sat with her hands folded on the table, her posture perfect, her face pale. She looked at Brent, who was still standing, panting like a cornered animal. Mara, Brent said. Honey. Mara shook her head slowly. I told you to stop lying. Brent, she said, I told you that if you lied one more time tonight, I was done. She reached into the small clutch purse she had kept on her lap all evening. She pulled out a small, silver object. It was a USB flash drive. She placed it on the table. It made a small clack against the wood. Brent stared at it. His eyes went wide. What is that? He whispered. It is the insurance policy, Mara said. She looked at Evelyn Kessler. You said you traced the emails to the IP address. Mara said to the lawyer, that proves they came from the house, but it does not prove who wrote them. Brent could still argue it was a hacker. He could argue it was a guest. She tapped the flash drive. But this proves who wrote them. She turned to look at me. 2 years ago, when I saw the drafts on Brent's laptop, I did not just read them. Mara said, I copied them. I copied the metadata. I copied the edit history. It shows Brent's user login. It shows the timestamps of him creating the files, editing the wording, and sending them. It shows him laughing about it in a chat log with a college friend. Brent looked as if he had been shot. He staggered back, gripping the back of his chair for support. You copied them, Brent stammered. Why would you do that? You are my wife. Mara looked at him, and her expression was one of profound exhaustion. Because I knew who I married. Mara said, I knew that one day you would try to throw someone under the bus to save yourself. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. She pushed the drive toward Evelyn. I kept it because I had a feeling that one day I would need a bargaining chip to get out of this family safely. She looked at Brent with cold, dead eyes. Consider this my resignation. Brent. The room was absolutely silent. The betrayal was total. Brent had turned on his mother. His mother had turned on logic. And now, his wife had revealed she had been sleeping next to him with a loaded gun under her pillow for 2 years. I looked at Mara. I saw the pain in her eyes, but I also saw the relief. She had been holding this breath for a long time. "Thank you," I whispered. Mara just nodded. Evelyn Kessler picked up the flash drive. She held it up so the police could see it. "This is the final nail," Evelyn said. "We have the motive, we have the opportunity, and now, thanks to Mrs. Parker, we have the forensic proof of intent." She opened her folder again and pulled out another sheet of paper. She laid it over the timeline she had established earlier. "Let us look at the pattern one last time," Evelyn said. She pointed to the dates. June 10th. Violet has a second interview with FedEx Supply Chain. June 9th. An email is sent from Brent's laptop claiming Violet has a history of insubordination. She moved her finger. August 3rd. Violet is shortlisted for a logistics coordinator role at Target. August 2nd. An email is sent claiming Violet was fired from a previous job for harassment. Evelyn looked at my father. It happened every single time. Evelyn said, "Every time she tried to stand up, you kicked her legs out from under her. It was clockwork. It was a prison built out of emails and lies." Derek slumped in his chair. The fight was draining out of him. He looked old. He looked defeated. But Jonah Pike was not defeated. He was getting impatient. He watched the family tear itself apart with the disinterest of a man watching a boring movie. He checked his watch again. He tapped the silver pen on the table. "This is all very tragic," Jonah said. "Really. Shakespearean. The wife betrays the husband. The son betrays the mother. Very entertaining." He looked at Derek. "But we are forgetting something." Jonah leaned forward. His voice dropped, losing the sarcastic edge and becoming something much colder, much more dangerous. "We are forgetting the money." Derek. Derek flinched. He did not look at Jonah. Jonah turned to me. "Violet, your sister-in-law just handed the police enough evidence to put your brother in jail for defamation and tortious interference. Your grandfather has proved the forgery. The legal battle is over. You win. Congratulations." He clapped his hands once, a slow, mocking applause. "But there is a practical problem," Jonah said. He pointed at Derek. "Your father signed a preliminary agreement with the buyers 3 days ago. He told them the ratification was a formality. He told them he had your proxy. Based on that promise, the buyers released a non-refundable deposit into the Silver Ridge Construction operating account." Jonah paused for effect. "It was a significant sum." Jonah said, $200,000. I gasped. $200,000? That was more money than I had made in the last 5 years combined. Jonah smiled. "And where is that money now?" Jonah asked. Derek was shaking his head. No, don't tell her," Jonah commanded. "It is gone," Derek whispered. "What I asked. It is gone," Derek shouted, his voice cracking. "I had to pay the suppliers. I had to pay the back taxes on the equipment. The union was threatening to shut down the job site. I spent it the morning it hit the account." He looked at me, his eyes begging for mercy. "I thought you would sign," Derek said. "I thought I could talk you into it. I thought once the full sale went through, I would pay it back out of the closing funds. I was robbing Peter to pay Paul. Violet, I had no choice." Jonah leaned back in his chair. "So," Jonah said, "here is the situation. The buyer is not a bank. The buyer is a private equity group with, let us say, aggressive collection policies. If the deal does not close at midnight, they will want their $200,000 back, tomorrow morning." He looked at Derek. "Do you have $200,000? Derek shook his head. "No. You know I don't." Jonah looked at Brent. "Do you?" Counselor Brent was staring at the floor. "Broken. No." Jonah looked at me. "So, Violet," Jonah said, "if you do not sign that paper, the deal dies. And when the deal dies, The people who paid that deposit are going to come looking for it, and they are not going to sue. They are going to hurt people." He picked up the pen and held it out to me. "You can send your family to jail," Jonah said, "or you can save them from the hospital, because if you walk away now, you are leaving them to the wolves." I looked at my father. The man who had sneered at me for being poor. The man who had called me difficult. He was terrified. He was looking at me like I was the only thing standing between him and a broken kneecap. He borrowed money from loan sharks. I looked at Walter. He sold a company he did not own to pay off loan sharks he should never have met. Walter Caldwell sat quietly at the head of the table. He had watched the family implode with a sadness that seemed to carve lines into his face. He looked at Derek, then at Lynn, then at Brent. He stood up slowly. He looked at the police officers. "I think you have heard enough to establish the fraud," Walter said to them. Then he turned to Jonah. "And you, Mr. Pike, you think you can bully my granddaughter with threats of violence?" Walter walked over to where Derek was sitting. He looked down at his son-in-law. "You claimed you did this to protect her," Walter said. Derek looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I did. Walter, I swear. We just wanted to keep the family safe." Walter shook his head. "No. Derek," Walter said. He looked at Lynn, then at Brent. "Protection is standing in front of someone when the danger comes," Walter said. He gestured to the mess of papers, the lies, the betrayals. "What you did was stand behind her and use her as a shield." He looked back at Derek. "The word protection is just the word cowards use when they want to feel noble while they are doing something terrible." Walter turned to me. "Violet," Walter said. His voice was firm. "Do not look at the pen." "But Grandpa," I said, my voice trembling. "If they owe that money, if those people come, let them come," Walter said. He looked at Jonah Pike with eyes that were cold as ice. "Because Mr. Pike is forgetting one thing." "What is that?" Jonah asked, his eyes narrowing. Walter smiled. "The deposit was paid to Silver Ridge Construction," Walter said. "But the contract for the sale, the one you are trying to get Violet to sign," he pointed to the blue folder. "It lists the seller as Ironclad Holdings." Walter leaned in close to Jonah. "If the deal falls through, Derek owes the money, but you, Mr. Pike, you are the one who promised the goods you could not deliver. You are the broker who took a deposit on a stolen car." Walter's smile vanished. "When the wolves come, Mr. Pike, they are going to eat you first." The threat of violence hung in the air like cigar smoke, thick and choking. Jonah Pike was looking at my grandfather with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, realizing that the old man had anticipated the leverage. But before Jonah could formulate a counterattack, Evelyn Kessler opened the third and final section of her briefcase. She did not slam these documents down. She placed them on the table with a gentle, almost funereal silence. These were not timelines or email logs. These were heavy, bound documents with red stamps on the cover. "You asked about the money," Evelyn said, looking at me. "You asked why a father would steal from his daughter. You asked why a mother would sabotage her child's career to keep her dependent." She slid the documents toward the center of the table, pushing aside the congealed gravy boat. "It was never about love, Violet," Evelyn said, "and it was never really about control. It was about gravity." I looked down at the papers. The text was dense, but the headers were bold and unmistakable. Notice of default, foreclosure proceedings, civil lawsuit for non-payment of services. All of them were addressed to Silver Ridge Construction. All of them were addressed to Derek Parker. I picked up the top sheet. It was a final notice from a lumber supplier. My father owed them $450,000. The date on the notice was 18 months ago. I picked up the next one. It was a letter from the bank. The mortgage on the house, this house, with its marble countertops and hardwood floors, was 6 months in arrears. I felt a wave of dizziness. I looked around the room. I looked at the heavy velvet curtains my mother had ordered from Italy. I looked at the expensive suit my father was wearing. I looked at the gold watch on Brent's wrist. "It is all fake," I whispered. I looked at my father. He was staring at the table. his shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. "Dad?" I asked. My voice was barely audible. Derek did not look up. "We had a bad run." Derek mumbled. "The market turned. The contracts in the suburbs dried up. We had supply chain issues. It was just a cash flow problem." "A cash flow problem?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was sharp. "You have been insolvent for 5 years. Derek, you have been paying the interest on one loan by taking out a second loan. You have been robbing Peter to pay Paul. And when Paul ran out of money, you started robbing your daughter." I stared at him. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My poverty, the ramen noodles, the broken heaters, the anxiety over gas money. It wasn't because the family was teaching me a lesson. It was because the family was broke. They were driving luxury cars and hosting Christmas dinners on fumes. While I was living in reality, you used my company as an ATM. I said. Derek finally looked up. His eyes were red, desperate. "We were going to pay it back," he insisted. "It was a bridge Silveridge just needed to weather the storm. Once the new development contract in Dublin came through, we were going to refill the coffers. We were going to put every cent back into Glaciergate before you even knew it was gone. But you didn't." I said. "You took more. We had to maintain appearances." Derek shouted. "Do you know what happens if people find out a developer's broke? The contracts stop. The banks pull the lines of credit. We had to keep the lights on. We had to keep the club membership. We had to keep this house." He gestured wildly at the dining room. "If we lost this house, Violet, we lost everything. Our standing, our reputation, my name in this town." I looked at him with horror. "Your reputation?" I asked. "You let me live in squalor so you could keep your country club membership. You stole my future so you wouldn't have to admit you failed. It is not that simple," Lynn cried out. She was dabbing her eyes with a napkin, but the tears seemed less like sorrow and more like panic. "We just borrowed it." "Violet," Lynn said. She used the word borrowed like a shield. "It started small. Just a little transfer to cover payroll, then a little more for the mortgage. It was so easy. The money was just sitting there in the Glaciergate accounts. You weren't using it. You didn't even know it was there." She looked at me pleadingly. "It became a habit," she admitted. "A bad habit. Like dipping into the cookie jar." We kept telling ourselves, "Just one more month. Just one more transfer." And then suddenly, it was 4 years later, and the hole was too deep to climb out of. And that is when you called me. Jonah Pike said. We all turned to look at him. Jonah was leaning back, cleaning his fingernails with the edge of a business card. He looked completely unbothered by the emotional devastation occurring around him. To him, this was just the balance sheet of a failed enterprise. They were drowning. Jonah said to me, he pointed at Derek and Brent. "Your father called me 6 months ago. He didn't want a consultant. He wanted a liquidator. He wanted someone who could strip the copper out of the walls without the neighbors hearing the noise." Jonah dropped his hand to the table. "They proposed a deal." Jonah said, "They knew I had connections with buyers who don't ask too many questions about provenance. They offered to hand over full control of Glaciergate, a quick, dirty transfer, in exchange for a lump sum cash injection that would clear the Silveridge debts." He smiled. A cold, shark-like expression. "That is why the paperwork is messy. Violet, speed costs extra. They wanted the money fast. So we cut corners on the legalities. We forged the board resolutions. We bypassed the audit periods." He looked at Brent, "And we needed a signature from the owner." Jonah said, "A signature that matched the one on file." The room went deadly silent again. I looked at the documents Evelyn had laid out earlier, the timeline, the signature pages, the Violet Parker, written in blue ink on dates when I was miles away. I had assumed, up until this moment, that it was a collaborative effort, a digital copy, a trace. But Jonah's words hung in the air, a signature that matched. I looked at my hands, then I looked at my mother. She had terrible handwriting. My father wrote in block capitals. I turned my head slowly to look at Brent. My brother, the lawyer, the artist who had always been good at drawing, the one who used to forge Mom's signature on his report cards in high school so he wouldn't get grounded. I saw the way he was holding his water glass. His hand was shaking so badly the water was rippling. Who signed them? Brent, I asked. My voice was very quiet. You blamed the notary. You blamed a clerical error. You blamed a hacker for the emails. I stood up and walked around the table until I was standing right behind his chair. He flinched, hunching his shoulders as if he expected me to hit him, but I didn't hit him. I leaned down and whispered in his ear. Who became me? I asked. Brent didn't answer. He couldn't. He was hyperventilating. It was him. The voice came from across the table. Mara. She was still holding the USB drive she had produced earlier. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. She looked at her husband with a profound, terrifying disappointment. He practiced for weeks. Mara said. She looked at me. I came home early one day about 4 years ago. He was in his study. He had sheets of tracing paper spread out over his desk. He had a copy of your lease agreement taped to the window so the light would shine through it. Mara took a shaky breath. He was tracing your signature. Violet, over and over again, hundreds of times. Then he would try it freehand on a blank pad. He would sign, compare it, crumple it up, and do it again. She looked at Brent's back. I asked him what he was doing. Mara said, he told me he was helping you with some legal filings because you were out of town and you gave him permission. He said he was doing you a favor. She laughed bitterly. He looked so proud of himself. Mara said, he held up a sheet of paper and said, Look, Mara, I can do it better than she can. I can be Violet Parker better than Violet Parker. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. It was a violation deeper than theft. My brother hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my identity. He had sat in his office, wearing his expensive suit, and practiced erasing me. Brent turned in his chair, looking at his wife with wide, frantic eyes. Mara, please, Brent begged. You do not understand. I had to. Dad said we needed the liquidity. If I didn't sign, the business would have collapsed. I was saving the family. Mara reached into her pocket. She pulled out her phone. She did not look at him. She tapped the screen a few times, navigating to a file she had saved. You weren't saving the family, Brent, Mara said. You were enjoying it. She placed the phone on the table. This was from a phone call you made to Jonah the night before Christmas Eve. Mara said, You were in the garage. You thought I was asleep. She pressed play. The audio was clear. It was Brent's voice, but it wasn't the whiny, panicked voice he was using now. It was arrogant. It was the voice of a man who thought he had won. Yeah, the documents are ready. The recording of Brent said, I put the final signature on the transfer deed an hour ago. It is perfect. She will never know. There was a pause on the recording. Then Jonah's muffled voice on the other end. Then Brent laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. Do not worry about Violet. The recording continued. She is clueless. She thinks she is coming over for a turkey dinner. We will get her to sign the ratification over dessert. Once that is done, we flush the toilet. Christmas signing finishes that little brat. Then I can finally buy that Porsche. The recording ended. The silence in the dining room was absolute. I stared at the phone. Finishes that little brat. Buy that Porsche. I looked at the watch on Brent's wrist, the watch I had bought him by working double shifts. He wasn't a victim of my mother's manipulation. He wasn't a scared son trying to help his father. He was a predator. He had sold me out for a sports car. Brent looked at me. The mask was completely gone now. There was no more good brother act. There was only naked fear. Violet. Wait, he stammered. I was just talking big. You know how guys talk. I didn't mean it. I looked at him, and I felt something inside me break. It was the last tether of affection I held for him. It snapped, clean and final. You practiced my name, I said. I walked back to my seat. But I didn't sit down. I stood next to my grandfather. You practiced my name so you could erase my life, I said. I looked at Derek, then at Lynn. You are all broke. I said, you are all liars, and you are all thieves. I looked at Jonah Pike. You said you only care about the paperwork. I said, you said you don't care about the family. I picked up the silver pen. Jonah's eyes lit up. He thought he had won. He thought the fear of the debt had finally broken me. Excellent, Jonah said. Just sign on the line. Violet, we can end this nightmare right now. I held the pen in my hand. It was heavy, expensive. I looked at the blue folder. Then I looked at my grandfather. Walter gave me a barely perceptible nod. I looked back at Jonah. I have one more question, I said. Jonah sighed. What is it? I looked at the police officers. If I sign this, I said, I am ratifying a fraud. I am becoming an accomplice to a crime that has already been committed. I turned the pen over in my fingers, but if I don't sign it, I looked at Derek. Then the fraud stands, and the theft stands, and the forgery stands. I looked at Brent, and the evidence stands. I dropped the pen. It hit the table and rolled off the edge, clattering onto the floor near Brent's feet. I am not signing, I said. Derek let out a sound like a dying animal. Violet. You are killing us, he screamed. The loan sharks. The bank. They will take everything. I looked at him with zero sympathy. They can't take everything. Dad, I said. I pointed to the documents Walter had brought, the original deed to Glacier Gate. Because you don't own everything. I looked at Walter. The company is still mine. Isn't it? Walter smiled. A genuine, proud smile. 100%, Walter said. Then I guess, I said, looking at my family, you are going to have to find another way to pay for your dinner. The sound of the silver pen hitting the floor echoed like a gavel strike. It rolled across the hardwood and came to a stop against the leg of my brother's chair. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the dining room was so tight that it felt like a single sudden breath might shatter the windows. I looked at my family. The tears I had shed earlier were gone. The confusion I had feigned was gone. The trembling in my hands had ceased completely. I felt a strange, cold clarity washing over me, the kind of calm that comes when you finally realize that the monster under your bed is just a man in a cheap suit. I turned my head slowly toward my sister-in-law. Mara, I said. My voice was different. It was lower. It lacked the desperate, high pitch of the daughter seeking approval. It was the voice of the owner of Glacier Gate Logistics. Play the rest, I commanded. Brent's head snapped up. Violet, do not do this, he stammered. I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on Mara. Play the part where he explains how they were going to handle Grandpa, I said. Mara nodded. She tapped the screen of her phone again. The audio recording resumed. It was still the garage conversation, the one Brent had thought was private. The quality was crisp, capturing the arrogant echo of his voice against the concrete walls. We have to be careful with the old man. Brent's recorded voice said, Walter is sharp, but he is old. If he questions the transfer, we just gaslight him. We tell him his memory is slipping. We tell Violet that Grandpa is getting confused, that he is mixing up the trust funds. There was a pause on the recording, followed by a cruel chuckle. She will believe us, Brent said. She always believes us. She is soft. We tell her we are fixing Grandpa's mistakes. We paint him as senile. By the time he figures out the company is gone, we will have the cash and he will be arguing with a nurse in a retirement home. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of horror. It was one thing to steal from me. It was another thing entirely to plot the psychological destruction of our grandfather, the man who had built the fortune they were cannibalizing. Brent made a noise, a guttural, animalistic grunt of panic. He lunged across the table. His hand shot out, clawing for the phone sitting in front of Mara. He was fast, fueled by the adrenaline of a man watching his life disintegrate. Give me that, Brent screamed, but he never reached the phone. Walter Caldwell moved with a speed that belied his 82 years. He did not stand up. He simply reached out and clamped his hand around Brent's wrist. His grip was iron. He slammed Brent's arm down onto the table, pinning it against the lace tablecloth. He did not shout. He did not look exerted. He just held him there, staring into his grandson's terrified eyes. Sit down, boy, Walter said. His voice was low, vibrating with a quiet, terrifying menace. You are not going to touch that phone, and you are not going to touch your wife. Brent struggled for a second, then went limp. He realized perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was physically and morally outmatched. He sank back into his chair, rubbing his wrist where Walter's fingers had left white marks. I looked at the police officers. They had stepped forward when Brent lunged, hands on their belts, but they relaxed slightly when Walter took control. They were letting this play out. I turned to Evelyn Kessler. The lawyer was watching the scene with a grim satisfaction. She opened her briefcase again, not to take something out, but to rearrange the files she had already displayed. She looked like a chess player arranging the board for the final checkmate. "You knew," I said to Evelyn. I looked at my grandfather. "You knew about the plan to paint you as senile." Walter nodded. "I have known for a month," Walter said. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Mr. Caldwell contacted my firm 4 weeks ago." Evelyn announced to the room. He had received the misdirected email, yes, but he also had his suspicions about the sudden decline in communication from the family. He hired private investigators to monitor the financial chatter around Silver Ridge Construction. She looked at Derek, who was staring at his plate as if wishing he could dissolve into the pattern. "We knew Derek was shopping the company around," Evelyn said. "We knew he was meeting with Jonah Pike. We even knew about the forged signatures on the preliminary documents. Then why, I asked. Why wait until Christmas? Why wait until dinner?" I felt a flash of anger. "You let me walk into this," I said. "You let them humiliate me. You let me sit here and listen to them lie to my face for an hour. Why didn't you stop them yesterday? Because we needed the broker," Walter said. He pointed a finger at Jonah Pike. "If I had confronted Derek yesterday, he would have denied it. He would have shredded the documents. He would have blamed it on a clerical error, just like he tried to do tonight. And without the other party present, it would have been a messy family lawsuit." He said, she said, Walter's eyes locked onto Jonah. "I needed the buyer in the room," Walter said. "I needed the man who was holding the pen. I needed you to see them together, and I needed them to think they were safe enough to confess." Evelyn nodded. "We needed the conspiracy to be active," she said. "We needed Jonah Pike to produce the contract. We needed Brent to admit to the emails. We needed the trap to be baited with their own arrogance." She looked at Jonah, and it worked. Jonah Pike was sitting very still. The color had drained from his face, leaving his expensive tan looking sallow and gray. He was calculating. I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was a mercenary. He had no loyalty to my father, no loyalty to Brent, and certainly no loyalty to the family honor. He was looking at the police. He was looking at the evidence, and he realized he was the only person at the table who was not related by blood. He realized he was the scapegoat. Jonah let out a long breath. He picked up his napkin and dabbed his forehead. "Okay," Jonah said. He dropped the napkin on the table. "I would like to state for the record that I was misled regarding the internal dynamics of this ownership group." Derek's head snapped up. What Derek hissed. "What are you doing?" Jonah ignored him. He turned his body toward the police officers, offering them his full attention. "I was approached by Derek and Brent Parker to facilitate a swift liquidity event," Jonah said. His voice was calm, professional, detached. "They assured me that they had full power of attorney. They assured me that the beneficiary, Violet Parker, was incapacitated, and that her signature was a formality they were authorized to execute." He pointed at the blue folder on the table. "I have emails," Jonah said. "I have text messages from Derek stating explicitly that he had the authority to sell. I have the wire transfer instructions he sent me. If there was forgery involved, I was not a party to it. I was a victim of their misrepresentation." He looked at Evelyn. "I am willing to cooperate fully," Jonah said. "I can provide the entire paper trail, the names of the buyers, the offshore accounts they wanted the money sent to, everything." "You traitor," Derek screamed. My father slammed his fist onto the table, making the glasses jump. "You stood in my office and told me how to do it," Derek yelled, his face purple with rage. "You told me to use Ironclad Holdings. You told me how to structure the shell company so the IRS wouldn't flag it. You said we were partners. I was a consultant," Jonah said coldly. "I gave advice based on the facts you presented. You lied about the facts. You took a commission," Derek shouted. "You took $50,000 off the top of the deposit." Derek stopped. His eyes went wide. He realized what he had just said. The room went silent. Evelyn Kessler smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had just felt the trap snap shut. "Thank you, Derek," Evelyn said. She reached into her briefcase one last time. "We were missing that specific number." Evelyn said, "We knew there was a deposit. We knew it went into the Silver Ridge account, but we weren't sure of the exact split." She pulled out a stapled document and slid it toward my father. "This is the bank statement for the joint checking account of Derek and Lynn Parker." Evelyn said. She pointed to a line item dated 3 days ago. "Here is the deposit," she said. $200,000, labeled as consulting retainer from Ironclad Holdings. She pointed to the next line. "And here's a transfer of $50,000 back out," she said, "to an account in the Cayman Islands." She looked at Jonah. "Presumably. That is your commission, Mr. Pike?" Jonah did not answer. He just tightened his jaw. "And here," Evelyn continued, pointing to the remaining balance, $150,000. She looked at Lynn. "It was used to pay off the credit card debt for this house. It was used to pay the country club dues. And it was used to book a vacation to St. Bart's for next week." She looked up at my mother. "You were going to celebrate," Evelyn said. "You were going to sell your daughter's company, bankrupt her future, and then go sit on a beach and drink margaritas with the money." Lynn put her hands over her face and began to sob. It was a raw, ugly sound. "We needed a break," Lynn wailed. "It has been so hard. The stress. We just wanted to feel normal again." I felt a nausea rising in my throat. They weren't just desperate. They were entitled. They felt they deserved my money more than I did because they were the parents, and I was just the resource. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. I looked at the head of the table. "Grandpa," I said. Walter looked at me. His eyes were full of a deep, aching sorrow. "When did you know?" I asked. "Not about the forgery, not about the sale." I gestured to the life I had lived for the last 4 years. The cheap clothes, the hunger, the constant feeling of being small. "When did you know they were doing this to me?" I asked. Walter stood up. He walked over to me and placed his hands on my shoulders. His grip was warm and solid. I suspected it for a long time. Walter said softly, "But I didn't know the extent of it until I saw you walk in tonight." He touched the fabric of my cheap coat, which was hanging on the back of my chair. "I gave them that company to make you free," Walter said. "I wanted you to have the power to say no. I wanted you to have the power to walk away." He looked at Derek and Lynn. "But they knew that," Walter said. "They knew that money is independence, and they knew that if you were independent, you would leave them. You would see them for what they are." He looked back at me. "So they kept you poor," Walter said. "They kept you hungry, because a hungry dog stays near the table." Tears pricked my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I was done crying for them. "They starved me." I said. "Yes," Walter said. "They starved you to keep you small." He stepped back and looked at the family. "But you are not small, Violet. Not anymore." The atmosphere in the room shifted tectonically. It was no longer a dinner party gone wrong. It was a tribunal. The illusion of family hierarchy had been obliterated. My father was not the head of the household. He was a debtor and a thief. My mother was not the matriarch. She was an accomplice. My brother was not the golden child. He was a forger, and I was not the victim. I looked at the police officers. "Officer," I said. The older officer stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am." I pointed to the papers on the table, the forged deeds, the unauthorized transfers, the evidence of the stolen deposit. "I am the sole owner of Glacier Gate Logistics." I said, "My name is on the original title. I never authorized a sale. I never authorized a transfer, and I certainly never authorized a loan." I looked at Derek. "These people have confessed to conspiring to defraud me. They have confessed to forgery, and they have confessed to accepting stolen funds." Derek looked at me, his face pale as death. "Violet, please," he whispered. "We are family." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had told me I was difficult, the man who had let me sleep in the heat. I walked over to the table and picked up the silver pen from the floor where it had fallen. I placed it gently in front of him. "Family," I said, "is what you sold to pay for your country club membership." I turned back to the police. "I would like to press charges." I said. The words hung in the air. Final and absolute. "I want them all arrested." I said. I pointed at Jonah, him for fraud. I pointed at Brent, him for identity theft. And I pointed at my parents. And them. I said, for grand larceny. Lynn screamed. Derek slumped forward, burying his head in his arms. Brent just stared at the wall, catatonic. I looked at Walter. He nodded. "The dinner is over," I said. The dining room felt less like a home and more like a crash site. The wreckage of my family's dignity lay scattered among the crystal wine glasses and the uneaten sides. I had just declared war. I had just asked the police to arrest my own parents. But my grandfather, Walter Caldwell, was not finished. He was a man who believed that if you are going to amputate a limb, you do not leave a flap of skin connecting it. You cut clean through the bone, while my mother sobbed into her hands and my father stared at the table in a catatonic stupor. Walter reached down to the floor. He picked up his briefcase, which had been resting against his leg the entire evening. He set it on the table with a heavy final thud. It sounded like a coffin lid closing. He opened it and pulled out a single, thick document bound in blue paper. "You are worried about the police," Walter said, his voice calm and conversational. "You are worried about the $200,000 you owe to the loan sharks. You are worried about the shame." He slid the document across the table. It stopped in front of Derek. "But you should be worried about this." My father looked at the cover page. His eyes widened. He recognized the document. It was the Caldwell Family Trust, the massive financial reservoir that had funded his lifestyle, his business mistakes, and his arrogance for 30 years. "I updated my will this morning," Walter said. He spoke the words as if he were ordering coffee. "And I updated the beneficiary structure of the primary trust." Derek's hands shook as he reached for the paper. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. "You can't do that," Derek whispered. "It is irrevocable. The trust structure is fixed until you die." It was irrevocable. Evelyn Kessler corrected him. She didn't look up from her notes. "Until you violated the morality clause." "Morality clause," Brent croaked. He looked up, his face splotchy and tear-stained. "What morality clause?" "Section 7, paragraph 3. Evelyn recited from memory. "Any beneficiary found to have committed a felony involving financial fraud against another family member is automatically and permanently disinherited." She looked at Brent over the rim of her glasses. "It is a standard clause I put in 20 years ago," Evelyn said. "Walter insisted on it. He said he didn't want his money funding a civil war." Walter leaned forward. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon," Walter said, "the entirety of my estate, the liquid assets, the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, and the remainder of the Caldwell holdings has been transferred to a sole beneficiary." He pointed at me. "Everything goes to Violet. My mother, Lynn, stopped crying instantly. She looked up, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The tears dried up as if a switch had been flipped. No Lynn screamed. She stood up, knocking her chair back. "You cannot do that." "Dad, that is our money. We waited for it. We took care of you. We visited you every Sunday. You visited my checkbook every Sunday," Walter replied coldly. He looked at her with a disappointment so deep it looked like physical pain. "I am leaving you nothing, Lynn. Not a cent. Not the house. Not the cars. Nothing. But we have debts," Lynn shrieked. Her voice was piercing. "We have the mortgage. We have the loan sharks. If you cut us off, they will kill us." Walter picked up his wine glass. He swirled the liquid, watching the red vortex. "Then I suggest you get jobs," Walter said. He took a sip. "I hear the logistics industry is hiring. Maybe you can drive a truck for Violet." The brutality of the statement sucked the oxygen out of the room. My parents weren't just facing prison. They were facing the one thing they feared more than jail poverty. They were facing the very life they had forced me to live for 4 years. Evelyn Kessler cleared her throat. And just to be clear, Evelyn said, this is not something you can fight in probate court. She tapped the document. The moment you touched Glaciergate, you triggered the audit. The transfer of assets out of Violet's name without her physical presence flagged the account at the holding firm. My office was notified automatically. She looked at Jonah Pike. That is why we let you keep talking. Mr. Pike, we needed to see how deep the rot went. We needed to see if you were just a bad broker or a co-conspirator. Jonah Pike was staring at his hands. He looked small. The swagger was gone. The expert persona had dissolved, leaving behind a terrified middleman who realized he was the only person in the room without a last name to protect him. I didn't know about the morality clause, Jonah whispered. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes pleading. I didn't know about the family trust. I was just hired to move the logistics company. Look, I can fix this. He started talking fast, the words tumbling out. I have the files on my laptop. I can reverse the wire transfer instructions. I can cancel the deal with the private equity group before midnight. I can tell them it was a compliance error. I can get the money back most of it. He looked at Derek. I can testify. Jonah said, I can give you the dates. I can give you the recordings of the meetings. Brent gave me the physical files. He met me at a diner on 3rd Avenue. He handed me the folder and told me, do not worry about the signature. I handled it. He told me he had a clean fix for the ownership issue. You liar, Brent shouted. My brother stood up again, his face twisted into a snarl. He turned toward me. He didn't look like a lawyer anymore. He looked like a rabid dog. You set us up, Brent screamed at me. Spittle flew from his lips. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. You knew. You sat there all night with that stupid look on your face, eating your turkey, pretending you were confused, but you knew. You knew everything from the start. He laughed, a manic, hysterical sound. You let us dig the grave, Brent shouted. You let us sign the papers. You let us incriminate ourselves. You are a witch. Violet, you watched us hang ourselves. I stood perfectly still. I let his words wash over me. Thank you, Brent, I said softly. He blinked, confused by my reaction. What you just confirmed it, I said. I looked at the police officers. He just admitted that I wasn't involved. I said, he just admitted that I was pretending not to know, which means he knows I didn't sign those papers. Because if I had signed them, I wouldn't have to pretend. Brent's mouth fell open. He realized, too late, that in his anger, he had handed the prosecutor the final piece of the puzzle. He had testified against himself. He slumped back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He put his head in his hands. I didn't know everything, I said. I spoke to the room, but I was looking at my father. I suspected. I said, I walked over to the window, looking out at the snow falling in the dark. For months, I felt like something was wrong. I would get rejected from a job, and the rejection letter would feel personal. I would come home to my apartment, and I would feel like someone had been there. Not a burglar, just a presence. I turned back to them. I thought I was going crazy. I said, I thought I was paranoid. My own mother told me I was paranoid. She told me I needed therapy. She told me to take pills. I looked at Lynn. You tried to medicate my intuition. Mom, you tried to drug the truth out of me. I took a deep breath, but then Grandpa called me yesterday. I said, he didn't tell me everything. He just said, Violet, come to dinner on time. And do not sign anything until I put my glass down. I looked at Walter. That was all I needed. I said, because unlike you, Grandpa has never lied to me. Derek let out a roar of frustration. He swept his arm across the table, sending the centerpiece, the candles, the pine cones, the expensive china bowl crashing to the floor. It is not fair, Derek screamed. We built this family. We gave you life. And you are going to destroy us over money, over a business you didn't even earn. He was panting, his face red, his eyes bulging. You are a parasite, Violet Derek shouted. You are a cold-hearted, selfish little ding-dong. The doorbell cut him off. It wasn't the hesitant ring of a guest. It wasn't the polite chime of a neighbor. It was a long, solid press, continuous, urgent. Derek froze. The insults died in his throat. He looked at the door, then he looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was exactly 9 o'clock. My mother stopped breathing. Brent looked up from the floor. Jonah Pike closed his eyes as if praying for teleportation. "Who is that?" Lynn whispered. Her voice was barely a squeak. "Is it the loan sharks?" Walter Caldwell stood up. He picked up his napkin one last time, folded it into a perfect square, and placed it on the table next to the ruin of the dinner. "No. Lynn," Walter said. "The loan sharks don't ring the doorbell." He adjusted his cuffs. "That is the reason I asked you to start dinner at 6 o'clock sharp," Walter said. He looked at Derek. "I knew it would take exactly 3 hours to peel back every layer of this lie. I knew you would deny it at 6. I knew you would bargain at 7. I knew you would fight at 8. He looked at the door as the bell rang again. And I knew that by 9, you would be finished." Evelyn Kessler looked at her wristwatch. She tapped the glass face. "They are right on time," Evelyn said. She looked at the police officers standing by the archway. "Officers," Evelyn said, "you can let them in. These aren't the responding patrol units. These are the detectives from the Financial Crimes Division." "Detectives." Derek gasped. Evelyn nodded. "I filed the digital evidence packet with the district attorney's office at 5:59. Evelyn said, "Just before we sat down to eat. We weren't waiting for you to confess to find out the truth." "Derek, we were waiting for you to confess to see if you had any soul left worth saving." She looked at him with cold pity. Clearly, the file was necessary. The front door opened. A blast of cold air rushed into the hallway, carrying the scent of snow and exhaust. Heavy boots stepped onto the hardwood floor. Not one pair, 4 pairs. The sound of radios crackled in the entryway. Police warrant execution. The voices were loud, professional, and devoid of any holiday cheer. I looked at my father, the man who had spent his life terrified of losing his reputation, the man who had sold his daughter to keep his name clean. He looked at the door, and then he looked at me. And in that moment, he realized that the poverty he had inflicted on me was about to become his permanent address. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just felt a heavy, exhausting weight lift off my shoulders. The trap hadn't just sprung. It had cleared the room. "Let them in," I said. The draft from the hallway was biting, carrying the scent of winter and the distinct, metallic smell of impending authority. The 4 detectives who stepped into the dining room did not look like the guests my mother usually entertained. They did not wipe their feet on the rug. They did not admire the garland on the staircase. They walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of men who had already read the file and knew exactly how the story ended. One of them, a man with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, stepped forward. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on the shattered centerpiece on the floor before locking onto my father. "Derek Parker," the detective asked. My father did not answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the badge clipped to the man's belt, as if it were a radioactive isotope. "I am Detective Miller with the Financial Crimes Division," the man said. He held up a folded piece of paper. "I have a warrant here for the seizure of all physical and digital evidence related to the business entities known as Silver Ridge Construction and Ironclad Holdings." He looked at Brent, then at Lynn. "I also have arrest warrants for Derek Parker, Lynn Parker, and Brent Parker on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, forgery in the first degree, and grand larceny." The words hung in the air, clinical and devastating. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic music. Just the flat, hard reality of the law entering a room that had been insulated from consequences for too long. Detective Miller gestured to the officers behind him. "Secure the evidence," he said. 2 officers moved toward the table. They didn't ask permission. They produced evidence bags. They began to collect the documents Evelyn Kessler had laid out with such precision: the timeline of my betrayal, the forged signature pages, the bank statements showing the stolen deposit. They moved efficiently, their latex gloves making a snapping sound that seemed incredibly loud in the silence. One officer took out a camera. Click. A photo of the fake deed. Click. A photo of the email logs. Click. A photo of the silver pen lying on the table. the weapon they had tried to force into my hand. It was a crime scene processing. My family dinner was being tagged and bagged. The detective looked at a clipboard. "Brent Parker," he said. My brother was still sitting on the floor where he had slid down moments ago. He looked up, his eyes dazed. "Stand up, son," the detective said. Brent didn't move. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing. "I am an attorney," Brent stammered. His voice was a whisper. "You cannot just— I need to see the warrant. I need to make a call. You can make a call from the station." The detective said, "Stand up. Now." An officer reached down and hauled Brent to his feet. My brother, who had spent the last hour screaming at me, who had practiced my signature to steal my life, went limp. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He turned around slowly, and the officer pulled his wrists behind his back. Click, click. The sound of handcuffs is distinct. It is the sound of total loss of control. Brent flinched as the metal bit into his skin. He looked at the watch on his wrist, the one I had bought him, and then he looked away. Shame finally overtaking him. "Derek Parker." The detective called out. My father stood up. He smoothed his suit jacket, a reflex of a man who still thought appearance mattered. He looked at the detective, then at Walter, and finally at me. He tried to summon the ghost of his old authority. "Officer, listen," Derek said. His voice was shaking, but he tried to make it firm. "This is a misunderstanding. This is a family dispute. We are just having a heated discussion about estate planning. There is no need for handcuffs. We can resolve this civilly. We will come down to the station tomorrow morning and clear this up." The detective looked at him with zero emotion. "This is not a civil dispute. Mr. Parker," the detective said, "when you accepted a wire transfer of $200,000 based on forged documents, it became a felony. The state of Ohio is the plaintiff now, not your daughter." He pointed to the door. "Turn around." Derek's face crumpled. The illusion that he could talk his way out of anything, that he could charm or bully the world into submission, vanished. He turned around. The officer cuffed him. My father let out a small, pathetic grunt as his shoulders were pulled back. "Lynn Parker," the detective said. My mother let out a wail that sounded like a siren. She dropped to her knees. It wasn't a faint. It was a collapse. She grabbed the edge of the tablecloth, pulling it with her, sending a half-empty wine bottle crashing to the floor. Red wine splattered across the hardwood like blood. "No, no, please," Lynn screamed. "I am a mother. I didn't do anything. I just wanted to keep the family together." She crawled forward, ignoring the officer reaching for her. She crawled toward me. "Violet, Violet. Tell them," Lynn begged. She reached out with her manicured hands, grasping at the hem of my cheap coat. "Tell them I am your mother. Tell them it was all a mistake. You cannot let them take me to jail. I cannot go to jail. I am claustrophobic, Violet. Please." I looked down at her. This woman who had birthed me. This woman who had told me I was crazy when I suspected the truth. This woman who had planned a vacation to St. Bart's with the money she got from selling my future. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "I love you," Lynn cried. "I did it for you, that for me. Baby, just tell them to stop." The room waited for my answer. The police paused, looking at me to see if the victim was going to recant. I felt a phantom pressure in my chest, the old instinct to fix things, to smooth it over, to take the pain so she wouldn't have to. But then I remembered the ramen noodles. I remembered the heat in my apartment. I remembered the email to Amazon that said I was a thief. I took a step back, pulling my coat out of her grip. I looked at her with a calmness that frightened even me. "You didn't do it for me, Mom," I said softly. I looked at the wine stain on the floor. "And I cannot tell them to stop," I said, "because I am not the one arresting you. The truth is—" Lynn screamed again, a raw sound of despair, as the officer pulled her up. She went limp, sobbing uncontrollably as the cuffs were fastened. Jonah Pike cleared his throat. He was standing by the window, his hands raised in the air, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. Detective Jonah asked. His voice was steady, the voice of a man cutting a deal. The detective looked at him. Jonah Pike. Yes, Jonah said. I would like to state that I have a cloud drive on my laptop containing every email, text message, and voice memo exchanged with the Parker family over the last 6 months. Derek whipped his head around, straining against the officer's grip. You rat! You filthy rat! Jonah ignored him. He kept his eyes on the detective. I can provide the account numbers they used, Jonah continued. I can provide the metadata for the forged documents. I was brought in under false pretenses, but I am willing to be a cooperating witness for the prosecution. I can give you the whole structure. The detective nodded slowly. We will take your statement downtown. Mr. Pike, the detective said, but you are coming in cuffs. 2. Accessing stolen funds is still a crime, even if you give us the receipt. Jonah nodded, accepting the loss. He held out his hands. He knew the game was over, and he was already calculating his parole. The officers began to move them toward the door. It was a procession of ruin. My brother, the forger, my father, the thief, my mother, the accomplice, and the broker who had sold them the rope. As they passed the table, Mara stood up. She was crying, silent tears running down her face. She looked at Brent as the officer guided him past. Brent looked at her. Mara, call my lawyer, please. Mara shook her head. I am not calling anyone. Brent, Mara said. She turned to look at me. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked over to where I was standing. She didn't try to hug me. She just stood there, looking at the wreckage of the family she had married into. I am sorry I didn't tell you sooner, Mara whispered. I was a coward. I was afraid of losing the house. I was afraid of being poor again. She looked at the empty doorway where her husband had just been let out. But tonight, when I heard him talking about the Porsche, she took a shaky breath. I didn't want to live with the lie anymore. Mara said, I would rather sleep in my car than sleep next to a man who could do that to his sister. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes. She was alone now, too. But she was clean. You won't have to sleep in your car. I said. I looked at Evelyn Kessler. Evelyn, can you make sure Mara has access to a hotel tonight and legal counsel for a divorce? Evelyn nodded, making a note on her pad. Consider it done. Mara sobbed once, a sound of pure relief, and covered her face. The front door opened and closed 4 times. The heavy boots faded. The shouting from the driveway, my father's blustering. My mother's wailing was cut off as the patrol car's doors slammed shut. The house fell silent. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the dinner. It was a clean silence. The air felt lighter. The oppressive heat seemed to dissipate. Walter Caldwell walked over to me. He looked tired. He looked every minute of his 82 years, but his eyes were clear. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. Are you okay? Walter asked. I looked at the empty chairs. I looked at the table where my family had sat an hour ago, plotting my destruction while passing the potatoes. I sent my parents to prison. Grandpa, I said. My voice sounded hollow. I destroyed the family. Walter shook his head firmly. He turned me so I was facing him. No, Violet, Walter said. He gestured to the evidence bags the police had left on the side table to collect. You didn't build the trap, Walter said. You didn't forge the papers. You didn't spend the money. He looked me in the eye. A house built on sand will fall. Violet, that is not the fault of the wind. It is the fault of the builder. They chose sand foundations. They chose them every day for 4 years. He squeezed my shoulder. You didn't make them fall. You just turned on the light so they could see the ground giving way. I took a deep breath. I felt my lungs expand fully for the first time in forever. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest, the one I had taken medication for, the one my mother had told me was just stress, was gone. I looked at the clock. It was 9:15. I looked at Evelyn. What happens now? I asked. Evelyn closed her briefcase. The sharp snap of the latches was the final period on the sentence. Now, Evelyn said, the district attorney takes over the criminal case. I will handle the civil asset recovery. We will liquidate Silver Ridge to pay back the creditors. We will sell this house to cover the mortgage. She smiled at me. And you, Violet. You have a company to run. I looked at the blue folder containing the deed to Glacier Gate. It was mine, really mine. Not a burden, not a secret, a future. I picked it up. I looked at the dining room one last time. I looked at the expensive curtains, the pretentious artwork, the hollow shell of a life my parents had constructed. I don't want anything from this house, I said. I turned to Walter. Grandpa, can you give me a ride, I asked. My car is Walter smiled. I think my driver is waiting. I walked toward the door. I didn't look back at the mess. I didn't look back at the memories. I stopped at the threshold. I turned to the empty room, to the ghosts of the people who had tried to erase me. From tonight on, I said to the silence, everything goes through the law. I stepped into the hallway, and my life, I said, buttoning my cheap coat, walks out of this house. I opened the front door. The cold air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. The snow was falling in soft, white flakes, covering the driveway, covering the tracks of the police cars, making everything new. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor was playing music. It was faint, drifting on the wind. Silent night. I stepped out into the snow. The door clicked shut behind me. It was a solid, heavy sound, the sound of an ending, and the sound of a beginning. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching my breath plume in the air. I inhaled the winter night. It didn't smell like fear anymore. It smelled like freedom. I walked down the steps, clutching the folder to my chest, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who Violet Parker was. She was the one who signed her own name. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Are you listening while driving, cooking, or maybe relaxing before bed? Please let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed Violet's journey, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people who need to see justice served. See you in the next story.